All right, this very first conversation that we're going to have is somewhat more of an academic one, um, in that in our everyday language, we often use emotions, feelings, affect, mood interchangeably. And we commonly think that one is the same as the other. But really, when we're looking at mood disorders, we need to kind of give some definition to each element of our emotional mood world. So I just want to kind of differentiate this because this is kind of how it's differentiated in the literature and whatnot, so that we kind of have an understanding as we move forward into mood disorders, the difference between emotions, feelings, and affect, or what we would call mood. Okay. The first thing we'll talk about is emotions. Okay. Emotions are the body's physiological reactions to a given situation. And then that cognitive interpretation will be the feelings of that. And the other part of emotions is it's our communication systems to other people and actions. Okay. So when we talk about emotions, just as this orange box down here in the middle, emotions play out in the theater of the body. Okay. Emotions are a physiological event. Okay. They're not psychological in nature. They are your body telling you whether something is going right or something is going wrong. And when we're talking about mood disorders, anxiety disorders, or stress disorders, this is when our emotional system, our physiological emotional system, has kind of gone haywire. Okay. And that's why a lot of medications and whatnot for anxiety and depression and those kinds of things have become very popular, because on the physiological level, we have a physiological system that is not reacting to environmental contingencies correctly. Okay. Feelings, on the other hand, are our cognitive interpretation of emotions. So feelings play out in the theater of the mind. Okay, so emotions are those physiological things. Feelings are those things that we use to interpret the emotions that we're having. Now, the importance in the differentiation between feelings and emotions is often we can cognitively incorrectly interpret our emotional state. Okay. So, one of the major symptoms, for example, of depression is what's called ruminating thoughts. So, the person feels physiologically depressed and worthless and out of the norm, and then those ruminating thoughts about, well, you must be feeling this way because you're useless, because no one loves you, because you're stupid, because you're worth less than it. Those cognitive interpretations feed that physiological reaction. Okay. And interpret what those depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms are telling the person. And we will see that one of the major therapies that is used for depression and anxiety is something called cognitive behavioral therapy. And on the cognitive end, it focuses specifically on these ruminating thoughts, and it challenges them on a cognitive level. Because the idea is that it's kind of a endless cycle between the physiological reaction and the cognitive interpretation. And so if we have a medication on board to help with the physiological end, and then we have a cognitive process through therapy to break that thought rumination, those cognitive interpretations, on that end, we're caring for both the emotions and the feelings, and we're correcting those both. Okay. Now, affect is our general mood. It's how we generally feel. Okay. When we look at people who kind of have depression that is a disordered behavior, versus depression because of experiences they have. This is one major differentiation, okay? If you talk to someone who truly has clinical generalized depression or seasonal affective depression, they constantly feel a depressed affect. Across situations and across time, meaning they wake up in a depressed mood, they go through their day with a depressed mood, and they go to sleep with a depressed mood, okay? And this is kind of the affect, how it's adding into it. This is a combination of our physiological and cognitive interpretations about how we should be feeling. And our body is reacting to that. So when people don't have that, they feel depressive symptoms, but they're not constantly in a depressed mood, we're going to look at things such as maybe trauma or loss of a loved one or something like that to target the symptoms. Whereas if it's a constant general depressed mood, we're going to treat it more as a disordered behavior, okay? And just this term right here, emotional schemas, this is our archetype. This is our representation of each of our moods and our feelings and our affect. It's kind of that that representation. So again, when we look at people who have depression and have anxiety disorders, they have a schema of depression. And so because they're meeting that schema, they see there's something wrong with them because they're not meeting the schema of someone who doesn't have depression. So people with these disorders tend to be very aware that their symptoms are disordered in some way or not right in a sense. Okay. All right. I just wanted to bring these up so as we get into the definitions and stuff of the different mood disorders. We're going to talk about two today. We're going to talk about depression or generalized depression and some of its subtypes. And then we're going to talk about bipolar, which is a mood swing between manic phases and deep depressive phases. Okay. But I'm going to stop sharing this one and I'm going to go back to our other one. I'm going to optimize sound. Okay. So what I'd like to do is just like what we did with, we're going to start with depression, and I'm going to start with a video, and then we're going to come back to these questions about medical model versus biopsychosocial model. What are the difference between them? When is intervention needed with depression? And you know, again, most people will experience depression at some point in their life. So what does that mean as far as being a disorder versus being part of the human race or being part of the human species? So, but again, let's play this video and then we'll go forward.
This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
You know what, gang? I think this is the wrong video. So instead of doing that, I apologize. I had one for a developmental class that I do, and I don't know how it ended up in here. Hold on just a second. So instead of watching a video, let's 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 go directly directly to symptomology. I apologize about that. Okay. So so the probably the depressive disorder that everyone is aware of is what's called major depressive disorder. This is the one that we commonly think about when we think about people who have a disorder known as depression. And then there are some subtypes such as seasonal affective disorder and some other types of depression, but tends to be the one that tends to be the one that everyone thinks about when they say, I have depression or I was diagnosed with depression. Okay. So let's go over these symptomologies and then we will go from there. We'll go back to those questions that were proposed in the beginning of this lecture. Okay. So for this situation, we're going to look for 5 or more symptoms in the following list. Okay. And the symptoms have to be present the same 2-week period and represent change from previous functioning. Okay, so again, going back to our definition, it has to be consistent over time, meaning that it has to happen for most days during that 2-week period. And it has to appear across contexts, across situations. And there has to be a noticeable difference in a person's functioning. Because sometimes when we're viewing people and whatnot, we may assume that they have depression, but it might also be their cultural way of being. Okay, so there's some countries, for example, in the Mediterranean area. There's some countries in some of the African and Pacific areas where Westerners have gone in and they say these people are the most depressed people in the world because they take their behavioral checklist of depression symptoms and they find that most of the people within those certain countries or those certain locations all have those behavioral traits. Okay. But when we go in, it's not that these individuals have a high rate of depression. It is more that those behaviors or those ways of being in a Western context look like those people are deeply depressed and sad and have a disordered behavior. So when we look at this becomes an important aspect, especially if someday you're working in a multicultural context, okay? Because you may someday, when you're being a professional, if you become a counselor or a social worker, you may work in an area that has a lot of migration from a lot of different places, and you'll run into probably some individuals that is their cultural norm, that their behaviors look like depression. And so this idea has been added to the diagnosis of depression because you have to see a change in the person's functioning to now call depression a disordered behavior. Okay. And as this notes, this is also an important aspect of depression, is one of these 2 major symptoms have to be present. Otherwise, we're going to need to do some other rule out diagnosis of a different disorder. Okay. And again, rule out just simply means that the symptoms that the person is experiencing overlaps with other disorders. So we need to make sure that we explore those other disorders before we go on and assume that the individual has depression. Okay. The first one is a depressed mood. So again, in previous functioning, maybe the person was spent most of the time in an upbeat, motivated mood, and then all of a sudden they're just feel very, very down and very, very tired and as it suggests, depressed. Okay, or if there's no depressed mood, there has to be, or I should say, or a loss of interest or pleasure. So an individual who maybe enjoyed going out Friday and Saturday nights and being with friends, all of a sudden are like, I don't want to go there anymore. I don't want to go get dressed. I don't want to. It's just it's just too much to do. Okay, that's an example of loss of interest or pleasure. Okay. And this one here is to this note that they put in here. Do not include symptoms that are clearly attributed to another medical condition. There are a lot of medical conditions, which we'll go over later on, that can cause depressive symptoms. Okay. For example, there are certain cancers. There are certain periods during somebody's diabetes where the neurotransmitters in the brains get affected by the imbalance of insulin and sugars, that it can create depressive symptoms. Okay. And so there's a lot of physical disorders that we'll get into that can also cause depressive symptoms. And it's important to note the difference. Okay, so what are the symptoms? That we have to have 5 or more of these. Depressed mood. So most days or nearly every day, as indicated by either a subjective report, feeling sad, empty, hopeless, or observation, appears tearful. Okay. And I'll tell you, someone who does a good clinical job, and I'll mention this right now, especially with adults, someone really should not be diagnosed with a psychological disorder unless they have been assessed at least 4 different times during 4 different places. Because what we should be looking for is not only the client's report of feeling sad, empty, and hopelessness. We should have some behavioral information that goes along with it, such as being tearful, being down, those kinds of things. As I noted, again, when we're looking at children and adolescents, this symptom can look very much like an anxiety disorder, or very much anxiety, because they'll be in a very irritable mood. Okay, that's very common with children and adolescents. Okay, and then so they either have to have 1 and or 2. So in these first 2, they have to either have a depressed mood or a diminished interest in pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day. And again, this is an important point to make. Remember, I know I keep hammering this in this class. In order for it to be a disordered behavior, it has to occur across contexts. So if a person just doesn't want to go to school, but they still have interest in staying home and gaming, or staying or going out with friends at night, that doesn't necessarily meet this criteria for depression. Okay. And again, this is by subjective account or by observation as well. Okay. All right, so now we have to have at least 4 of these other ones. If we only have depressed mood or lack of interest, we have to have 4 more out of this following list. Okay. One is significant weight loss, or when not dieting, or weight gain. So a lot of people with the disorder of depression tend to see about a 5% change in body weight within a month. Okay. or they can experience a decreased or increased appetite nearly every day. Okay. When we look at children, we want to look at, they tend to, when they're depressed, have a failure to make expected weight gains through their developmental period. So if they're a young child, age of 4, you tend to expect them to make a weight gain of about 1 to 2% a month. Okay. And if they're not making that, that would meet this criteria. Insomnia or hypersomnia, meaning that either we sleep too little or we sleep too much. Okay. And sometimes for this one, it can be a combination. It could be where the person one night can't sleep at all, and then they sleep maybe for a couple nights, and then they'll sleep for almost the entire night and most of the day to follow. It's really an interruption in the wake sleep cycle. Psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day, observed by others, not merely subjective feelings of restlessness and being slowed down. So this is one that we really kind of look to the person's external world, because again, when you have depressed moods, you can feel restless or being slowed down, but you might not be doing it motorly, meaning that it might not be something that is observable in a sense. And when we're looking at this criteria number 5, it's where you can actually observe the person sitting and they'll be bouncing their leg up and down while you're interviewing them, or they'll just be very kind of despondent physically. Okay. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. And this one's kind of self-explanatory. You just don't feel, you feel tired, you just don't want to do anything. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate things like guilt. And this, as I went back, going back to our conversation about feelings versus emotions, a lot of these times this can be delusional type of inappropriate guilt. Nearly every day, merely self-reproach or guilt about being sick. A lot of people with depression feel guilt for feeling depressed, and that's a symptomology of depression. Okay. Reoccurring thoughts of death or just fear of dying. Reoccurrent suicidal ideation without specific plans, or a suicidal attempt or specific plan for committing suicide. This one we will qualify later in the course when we talk about suicidal and suicidal ideation, because usually when you see number 9, you also need to look at the person's social world and really look at what's going on there, or whether they have some type of chronic physical disorder that is causing uncontrollable pain or uncontrollable annoyances. So number 9, later in the course, when we talk about suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts, we'll want to qualify this when we come back to that conversation. Okay. Again, it needs to cause distress or impairment in social occupation, and the episodes are not attributed to a physiological effect such as substance abuse or another medical condition. Okay. And again, this one is important, okay? Because if you think about some of the substance we take, such as alcohol, okay? Alcohol is a depressant. And while some people may experience things like elation or wakefulness when when they're utilizing alcohol, it is depressing the physiological system. And so it can bring about a lot of these symptoms that we're talking about. It's just because of alcohol's effect on a person's consciousness, they may not be aware of it until they get through, quote unquote, that buzz phase of the drinking. And then they get into that depressive mode of feeling because it's depressing the physiological system. Maybe this is the video that I wanted to show. Let's take a look at this one and see if it's the one I'm looking for. Yes, it is. Okay. So this video I want everyone to pay very close attention to, because we can go through these symptoms, but if we haven't experienced depression before, it's really hard to understand. And so I really want to, especially if you have not experienced depression before and everything, listen to this person's story and description to kind of get an understanding of it, because we all will go through moments of sadness. We'll all go through moments of guilt and worthlessness and stuff like that. That's not what clinical disordered depression is, okay? And so a lot of times people who haven't experienced clinical depression have a hard time wrapping our head around it. So this is a really good video on really understanding what the depressed, disordered individual is going through.
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till I felt that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I felt my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as if the heavens were a bell, and being were an ear, and I and silence some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. Just then, a plank in reason broke, and I fell down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. We know depression through metaphors. Emily Dickinson was able to convey it in language, Goya in an image. Half the purpose of art is to describe such iconic states. As for me, I had always thought myself tough, one of the people who could survive if I'd been sent to a concentration camp. In 1991, I had a series of losses. My mother died, a relationship I'd been in ended, I moved back to the United States from some years abroad, and I got through all of those experiences intact. But in 1994, 3 years later, I found myself losing interest in almost everything. I didn't want to do any of the things I had previously wanted to do, and I didn't know why. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to seep away from me in that moment. Everything there was to do seemed like too much work. I would come home and I would see the red light flashing on my answering machine. And instead of being thrilled to hear from my friends, I would think, what a lot of people that is to have to call back. Or I would decide I should have lunch, and then I would think, but I'd have to get the food out and put it on a plate and cut it up and chew it and swallow it. And it felt to me like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in discussions of depression is that you know it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous while you're experiencing it. You know that most people manage to listen to their messages and eat lunch and organize themselves to take a shower and go out the front door, and that it's not a big deal. And yet, you are nonetheless in its grip, and you are unable to figure out any way around it. And so I began to feel myself doing less and thinking less and feeling less. It was a kind of nullity, and then the anxiety set in. If you told me that I have to be depressed for the next month, I would say as long as I know it'll be over in November, I can do it. But if you said to me, you have to have acute anxiety for the next month, I would rather slit my wrist than go through it. It was the feeling all the time, like that feeling you have if you're walking and you slip or trip and the ground is rushing up at you, but instead of lasting half a second the way that does, it lasted for 6 months. It's a sensation of being afraid all the time, but not even knowing what it is that you're afraid of. And it was at that point that I began to think that it was just too painful to be alive, and that the only reason not to kill oneself was so as not to hurt other people. And finally one day, I woke up and I thought perhaps I'd had a stroke, because I lay in bed completely frozen, looking at the telephone, thinking something is wrong and I should call for help. And I couldn't reach out my arm and pick up the phone and dial. And finally, after 4 full hours of my lying and staring at it, the phone rang, and somehow I managed to pick it up. And it was my father. And I said, "I'm in serious trouble. We need to do something." The next day, I started with the medications and the therapy. And I also started reckoning with this terrible question. If I'm not the tough person who could have made it through a concentration camp, then who am I? And if I have to take medication, is that medication making me more fully myself? Or is it making me someone else? And how do I feel about it if it's making me someone else? I had 2 advantages as I went into the fight. The first is that I knew that, objectively speaking, I had a nice life, and that if I could only get well, there was something at the other end that was worth living for. And the other was that I had access to good treatment. But I nonetheless emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and finally understood I would have to be on medication and in therapy forever. And I thought, but is it a chemical problem or a psychological problem? And does it need a chemical cure or a philosophical cure? And I couldn't figure out which it was. And then I understood that actually we aren't advanced enough in either area for it to explain things fully. The chemical cure and the psychological cure both have a role to play. And I also figured out that depression was something that was braided so deep into us that there was no separating it from our character and personality. I want to say that the treatments we have for depression are appalling. They're not very effective. They're extremely costly. They come with innumerable side effects. They're a disaster. But I am so grateful that I live now and not 50 years ago, when there would have been almost nothing to be done. I hope that 50 years hence, people will hear about my treatments and be appalled that anyone endured such primitive science. Depression is the flaw in love. If you were married to someone and thought, well, if my wife dies, I'll find another one, it wouldn't be love as we know it. There's no such thing as love without the anticipation of loss, and that specter of despair can be the engine of intimacy. There are 3 things people tend to confuse: depression, grief, and sadness. Grief is explicitly reactive. If you have a loss and you feel incredibly unhappy, and then 6 months later you're still deeply sad but you're functioning a little better, it's probably grief, and it will probably ultimately resolve itself in some measure. If you experience a catastrophic loss and you feel terrible, and 6 months later you can barely function at all, then it's probably a depression that was triggered by the catastrophic circumstances. The trajectory tells us a great deal. People think of depression as being just sadness. It's much, much too much sadness, much too much grief at far too slight a cause. As I set out to understand depression and to interview people who had experienced it, I found that there were people who seemed, on the surface, to have what sounded like relatively mild depression, who were nonetheless utterly disabled by it. And there were other people who had what sounded, as they described it, like terribly severe depression, who nonetheless had good lives in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And I set out to find out what it is that causes some people to be more resilient than other people. What are the mechanisms that allow people to survive? And I went out and I interviewed person after person who was suffering with depression. One of the first people I interviewed described depression as a slower way of being dead. And that was a good thing for me to hear early on, because it reminded me that that slow way of being dead can lead to actual deadness, that this is a serious business. It's the leading disability worldwide, and people die of it every day. One of the people I talked to when I was trying to understand this was a beloved friend who I had known for many years and who had had a psychotic episode in her freshman year of college and then plummeted into a horrific depression. She had bipolar illness, or manic depression as it was then known. And then she did very well for many years on lithium, and then eventually she was taken off her lithium to see how she would do without it. And she had another psychosis, and then plunged into the worst depression that I had ever seen, in which she sat in her parents' apartment, more or less catatonic, essentially without moving, day after day after day. And when I interviewed her about that experience some years later, she's a poet and psychotherapist named Maggie Robbins. When I interviewed her, she said, "I was singing, 'Where Have All the Flowers Gone?' over and over to occupy my mind. I was singing to blot out the things my mind was saying, which were, you are nothing. You are nobody. You don't even deserve to live." And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. It's easier to help schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside of them that needs to be exorcised, but it's difficult with depressives because we believe we are seeing the truth. But the truth lies. I became obsessed with that sentence, but the truth lies. And I discovered as I talked to depressive people that they have many delusional perceptions. People will say, "No one loves me," and you say, "I love you, your wife loves you, your mother loves you." You can answer that one pretty readily, at least for most people. But people who are depressed will also say, "No matter what we do, we're all just going to die in the end." Or they'll say, "There can be no true communion between two human beings. Each of us is trapped in his own body." To which you have to say, "That's true, but I think we should focus right now on what to have for breakfast." A lot of the time, what they are expressing is not illness, but insight. And one comes to think what's really extraordinary is that most of us know about those existential questions, and they don't distract us very much. There was a study I particularly liked in which a group of depressed and a group of non-depressed people were asked to play a video game for an hour. And at the end of the hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. The depressive group was usually accurate to within about 10%. And the non-depressed people guessed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. A lot of people said when I chose to write about my depression that it must be very difficult to be out of that closet, to have people know. They said, "Do people talk to you differently?" And I said, "Yes, people talk to me differently. They talk to me differently insofar as they start telling me about their experience or their sister's experience or their friend's experience. Things are different because now I know that depression is a family secret that everyone has." I went a few years ago to a conference, and on Friday of the 3-day conference, one of the participants took me aside and she said, I suffer from depression and I'm a little embarrassed about it, but I've been taking this medication and I just wanted to ask you what you think." And so I did my best to give her such advice as I could. And then she said, "You know, my husband would never understand this. He's really the kind of guy to whom this wouldn't make any sense. So it's just between us." And I said, "Yes, that's fine." On Sunday at the same conference, her husband took me aside. And he said, "My wife wouldn't think that I was really much of a guy if she knew this, but I've been dealing with this depression and I'm taking some medication and I wondered what you think." They were hiding the same medication in 2 different places in the same bedroom. And I said that I thought communication within the marriage might be triggering some of their problems. But I was also struck by the burdensome nature of such mutual secrecy. Depression is so exhausting, it takes up so much of your time and energy, and silence about it, it really does make the depression worse. And then I began thinking about all the ways people make themselves better. I'd started off as a medical conservative. I thought there were a few kinds of therapy that worked. It was clear what they were. There was medication, there were certain psychotherapies, there was possibly electroconvulsive treatment, and that everything else was nonsense. But then I discovered something. If you have brain cancer and you say that standing on your head for 20 minutes every morning makes you feel better, it may make you feel better, but you still have brain cancer and you'll still probably die from it. But if you say that you have depression and standing on your head for 20 minutes every day makes you feel better, then it's worked, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And if you feel better, then you're effectively not depressed anymore. So I became much more tolerant of the vast world of alternative treatments. And I get letters. I get hundreds of letters from people writing to tell me about what's worked for them. Someone was asking me backstage today about meditation. My favorite of the letters that I got was the one that came from a woman who wrote and said that she had tried therapy, she had tried medication, she had tried pretty much everything, and she had found a solution and hoped I would tell the world. And that was making little things from yarn. She sent me some of them, and I'm not wearing them right now. I suggested to her that she also should look up obsessive-compulsive disorder in the DSM. And yet, when I went to look at alternative treatments, I also gained perspective on other treatments. I went through a tribal exorcism in Senegal that involved a great deal of ram's blood, and that I'm not going to detail right now. But a few years afterwards, I was in Rwanda working on a different project, and I happened to describe my experience to someone. And he said, well, you know, that's West Africa, and we're in East Africa, and our rituals are in some ways very different, but we do have some rituals that have something in common with what you're describing. And I said, oh, and he said, yes. He said, but we've had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers, especially the ones who came right after the genocide. And I said, what kind of trouble did you have? And he said, well, he said they would do this bizarre thing. He said they didn't take people out in the sunshine where you begin to feel better. They didn't include drumming or music to get people's blood going. They didn't involve the whole community. They didn't externalize the depression as an invasive spirit. Instead, what they did was they took people, one at a time, into dingy little rooms and had them talk for an hour about bad things that had happened to them. He said, we had to ask them to leave the country. Now, at the other end of alternative treatments, let me tell you about Frank Russakoff. Frank Russakoff had the worst depression, perhaps, that I've ever seen in a man. He was constantly depressed. He was, when I met him, at a point at which every month he would have electroshock treatment. Then he would feel sort of disoriented for a week. Then he would feel okay for a week. Then he would have a week of going downhill. And then he would have another electroshock treatment. And he said to me when I met him, it's unbearable to go through my weeks this way. I can't go on this way, and I figured out how I'm going to end it if I don't get better. But, he said to me, I heard about a protocol at Mass General for a procedure called a cingulotomy, which is a brain surgery, and I think I'm going to give that a try. And I remember being amazed at that point to think that someone who clearly had so many bad experiences with so many different treatments still had buried in him somewhere enough optimism to reach out for one more. And he had the cingulotomy, and it was incredibly successful. He's now a friend of mine. He has a lovely wife and 2 beautiful children. He wrote me a letter the Christmas after the surgery, and he said, my father sent me 2 presents this year. First, a motorized CD rack from the Sharper Image that I didn't really need, but I knew he was giving it to me to celebrate the fact that I'm living on my own and have a job I seem to love. And the other present was a photo of my grandmother, who committed suicide. As I unwrapped it, I began to cry, and my mother came over and said, are you crying because of the relatives you never knew? And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying now as I write to you. It's not that I'm so sad, but I get overwhelmed. I think because I could have killed myself, but my parents kept me going, and so did the doctors, and I had the surgery. I'm alive and grateful. We live in the right time, even if it doesn't always feel like it. I was struck by the fact that depression is broadly perceived to be a modern Western middle-class thing, and I went to look at how it operated in a variety of other contexts. And one of the things I was most interested in was depression among the indigent. And so I went out to try to look at what was being done for poor people with depression. And what I discovered is that poor people are mostly not being treated for depression. Depression is the result of a genetic vulnerability, which is presumably evenly distributed in the population, and triggering circumstances, which are likely to be more severe for people who are impoverished. And yet, it turns out that if you have a really lovely life but feel miserable all the time, you think, why do I feel like this? I must have depression. And you set out to find treatment for it. But if you have a perfectly awful life and you feel miserable all the time, the way you feel is commensurate with your life. And it doesn't occur to you to think, maybe this is treatable. And so we have an epidemic in this country of depression among impoverished people that's not being picked up and that's not being treated and that's not being addressed. And it's a tragedy of a grand order. And so I found an academic who was doing a research project in slums outside of DC, where she picked up women who had come in for other health problems and diagnosed them with depression, and then provided 6 months of the experimental protocol. One of them, Lolly, came in, and this is what she said the day she came in. She said, and she was a woman, by the way, who had 7 children. She said, I used to have a job, but I had to give it up because I couldn't go out of the house. I have nothing to say to my children. In the morning, I can't wait for them to leave, and then I climb in bed and pull the covers over my head. And 3 o'clock when they come home, it just comes so fast. She said, I've been taking a lot of Tylenol, anything I can take so that I can sleep more. My husband has been telling me I'm stupid, I'm ugly. I wish I could stop the pain. Well, she was brought into this experimental protocol, and when I interviewed her 6 months later, she had taken a job working in childcare for the US Navy. She had left the abusive husband, and she said to me, my kids are so much happier now. She said, there's one room in my new place for the boys and one room for the girls, but at night they're just all up on my bed and we're doing homework all together and everything. One of them wants to be a preacher, one of them wants to be a firefighter, and one of the girls says she's going to be a lawyer. They don't cry like they used to, and they don't fight like they did. That's all I need now, is my kids. Things keep on changing. The way I dress, the way I feel, the way I act. I can go outside not being afraid anymore. And I don't think those bad feelings are coming back. And if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I would still be at home with the covers pulled over my head, if I were still alive at all. I asked the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. I was really moved by these experiences, and